Hello everyone, thanks for joining us today for the March 2016 ONA Report webinar. Today's webinar is entitled Jiggs, Bermudagrasss and Limpograss Responses to Phosphorus and Potassium Fertilization. My name is Maria Silveira and I'm a soil scientist here at the UF-IFAS Range Cattle Research and Education Center. At the conclusion of today's presentation, my contact information will be displayed. So if you have any questions, please feel free to either email me or call me. So let's go ahead and start with the presentation. Before this presentation, I'll be reporting a 3-year field experiment that was conducted here at the Research Center between 2012 and 2014. But before we get to the actual data, I want to start by sharing with you some basic information about the importance of potassium and phosphorus in terms of plant nutrition. Let's start with potassium. Potassium is involved in multiple important functions in the plant, and understanding those functions will help us understand and interpret the results that I'm going to be sharing with you later during the presentation. So one of the important functions of potassium in the plant is involved in maintaining water balance and the opening and closing of stomata. So potassium is also required for the accumulation and translocation of newly formed carbohydrates. Typically, for most of the forage grasses that we grow in this region, tissue concentrations vary between 1 and 2%. But there are some crops that can have as much as 5% of potassium in the dry matter tissue. So typically, adequate potassium supply is often associated with resistance of these plants to disease and stress, and this stress can be any type of stress. It can be an environmental stress. It's also related to the winter hardness and also to stand longevity. So understanding these factors will be easier for us to interpret the results of this 3-year study later. So depending on the species, the forage species, and how we are managing these species, whether it's grazing or it's being mechanically harvested for hay, some of these forages that we grow here can use as much potassium as any other nutrients, more than nitrogen, for instance. In terms of soil potassium and the dynamics of potassium in the soil, potassium occurs primarily as an inorganic cation, and it's influenced by soil pH. So the first step in any soil fertility program is to adjust the pH, because the pH will affect the potassium and as well as the phosphorus dynamics in the soil and availability in the soil. But because potassium is primarily occurs as a cation, it's weakly sorbed by the soil particles. So in other words, it can also be subject to leaching, particularly in our area that are subject to heavy rainfall events. A significant amount of potassium can be leached out of the root zone. So I mentioned about soil pH, and if we look at the fertilizer efficiency, or in other words, how much of the nutrients the plants can actually take when they are applied as a fertilizer, as affected by the different pHs. If you look at just one pH unit, which is a very common situation, our native soils, usually the native pH is around 4.5. So if we increase the soil pH by just 1 unit, just increasing from 4.5 to 5.5, we can more than double the potassium and potassium fertilizer efficiency. The same is true for nitrogen. So again, the first step in designing any soil fertility program is to adjust the pH, because the pH can have some significant impact on how the plants are able to utilize these nutrients. Move on to phosphorus. Phosphorus is as important as potassium, but it's required in much less quantities as compared to potassium and nitrogen. In the plant, phosphorus is involved in different biochemical reactions. It acts as a catalyst of these reactions, including the conversion of the sun's energy into other compounds, into carbohydrates, for instance. It's also considered an energy unit. Phosphorus participates in important molecules that are considered the energy unit in the plants. And like I said, the tissue concentration, because the uptake is much less, the tissue concentration is much lower, 10 times lower than the potassium. So the tissue concentration usually range from 0.1 to 0.5% in the dry weight. And usually adequate adequate phosphorus supply is associated with adequate root development. So there is a close association between root development and phosphorus availability. So most of the crops, particularly under grazing systems, require very low amounts of phosphorus. But there is a concern that under mechanically harvested hay production system, because of the amount of phosphorus that is removed with above ground biomass, phosphorus can become deficient in the soil and therefore may limit the forage production and performance. So this table, what I'm showing you is the most common forage species that we grow in Central and South Florida, and the expected yields associated with these different species, and the amount of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium that these plants can accumulate in the above ground tissue. Usually, if you look at this table, the higher the production, usually the greater the nutrient requirement. Or in other words, if you have highly productive species such as Jiggs Bermudagrass or Chieftain Bermudagrasses, they produce more, but they also require higher levels of fertilization. If you look at Bermudagrass here, which is the most common planted species in Florida, it has lower production, but it also has much lower requirement of these nutrients. So in other words, if we managed a highly productive pasture such as Jiggs Bermudagrass the same way as we do with Bermudagrass, most likely we're not going to be very successful. So now that I explained the important role of potassium and phosphorus in the plant, why those nutrients become an issue. And the main reason is, although UF-IFA's fertilizer recommendations include P and K for both established, grazed, established Limpograss and Jiggs Bermudagrass, or for hay production, usually our recommendations are a little bit higher than what most producers can afford. So for instance, if we look at the hay production system, the recommended Universal Florida recommended rate for potassium is quite significant. So let's look at the recommendation. If you are producing Jiggs Bermudagrass hay, the recommended nitrogen rate is 80 pounds of nitrogen to the acre, and phosphorus and potassium, the recommendation will be based on soil testing. So let's say the soil test is very low in these two nutrients. The recommended rate for P can be anything from 60 to 80 pounds of P2O5 per acre, and the potassium can be anything from 20 to 40 pounds of K2O per acre. So let's assume that if you are managing a very intensive hay production system where these Jiggs Bermudagrass hayfields are cut 4 times a year, and if you want to follow the Universal Florida recommendations, these will be the amounts of nutrients required to supply. So in other words, if you follow the UF recommendations, you end up with a recommendation of 240 pounds of nitrogen to the acre, about 100 pounds of P2O5, and 160 pounds of K2O per acre. So the issue with this is the economics. Very few producers can actually afford to supply that amount of nutrients to their hayfields. The same thing is valid for Limpograss. This is our fertilizer recommendations for Limpograss, whether it's grazed or whether it's under hay production. Limpograss recommendations are a little bit less than Jiggs Bermudagrass, but still, assuming that the soil tested very low in P and K, and you are cutting 4 times the Limpograss hayfield, this will be the amounts of nutrients required. In other words, 240 pounds of nitrogen per acre, 40 pounds of P2O5, so the phosphorus requirement of Limpograss is significantly lower than Jiggs Bermudagrass, but quite a bit of phosphorus still. And if you look at the potassium, 120 pounds of K2O per acre per year. So these are considerably high fertilization rates. So what we decided to do 5 years ago was to design an experiment to evaluate how much we could cut down those fertilizer recommendations without negatively affecting not only the forage production, but what we were more concerned was the stand losses. As I indicated in the beginning of this presentation, potassium is very closely associated with stand losses. So not having enough potassium supply can result in significant damage to our stands. So the initial, as I indicated, the study was conducted here at the research center in Ona, and the initial soil pH was 5.3, so it was within the adequate range for these grasses, which is around 5.5. And the Melic 1 extractable P and K were median for P and very low for K. And what we evaluated were P and K reduced P and K fertilization rates. So in other words, we did 0, 40, and 80 pounds of K2O per acre, which correspond to, of course, nothing, 50%, and 100% of the recommended rate for established Jiggs Bermudagrasss pastures. The same with phosphorus, and we also evaluated 2 nitrogen levels, which correspond to 50% and 100% of the recommended nitrogen rate for this pasture. And we harvest these plots 4 times a year during 3 years. So this is the rainfall data for the 3-year that we're conducting the study. The reason why I want to show you this data is because it's going to help explain some of the responses we observed, particularly in year 2013. So if you compare 2012, the year that we initiated the study, and 2013, the cumulative rainfall for those years were significantly lower than our 71-year average. And 2013 was particularly not a good year because we also had some frost events in February and March. So the forage production during 2013 was severely affected by this weather, the weather pattern for that particular year. Conversely, in 2014, we had a very good year. We had a wet spring, and the cumulative rainfall for that year was much closer than, to our average than the previous 2 years. So if you look at the cumulative Jiggs Bermudagrass yield during that 3-year study, and here's the cumulative yield. So this is a sum of 4 harvests per year as affected by the potassium application rate. So 0, 40, and 80 pounds of K2O per acre. You're gonna see that there was a linear increase in Jiggs Bermudagrass production as I increase the K fertilization. And that increase, the difference between the control plots that didn't receive any potassium and the ones that received the highest potassium level increased as the study progressed. So in other words, the difference between the 0 and the 80 was about 44% in year 1. As we moved to year 3, the difference was about 370%. So the magnitude of that potassium, the effect of potassium increased as the study progressed. The other thing I want to highlight in this table is that if you look at the control, as I indicated, 2013, we had a very dry spring and associated with some late frosts in the growing season. So that the production we obtained in 2013 was significantly lower than 2012 and 2014. But even looking at the 2014, which was a very good year in terms of climatic conditions, rainfall, even at the highest K application rates, the production we obtained, the yields we obtained that year were significantly lower than the first year. So that indicated to us that even at this rate, we're not supplying enough potassium to maintain the production. And when we look at the second part of this table, which is the frequency ground cover, which basically tells me how much of the stand remained after the 3-year study. And this, by the way, this was evaluated at the end of the 3-year study in 2014. If you look at the ground cover, for instance, for the control plots, we only have 31% of Jiggs Bermudagrass remaining in the plots. So what that means is the other 69% were basically weeds that were invading the plots. When we compare to the higher K application, there was still quite a significant stand losses. So about 40% of the botanical composition of the plot consisted of weeds. So even though potassium was able to reduce the stand losses observed at the highest K rate were still pretty significant. So now moving on to some pictures of the actual research plots. This picture was taken at the beginning of the 2014 growing season, and it's very clear. These are the control plots. It's very clear. You can see the bare ground, very few growing plants here, and there's lots of weeds, in fact. So the visual difference between the treatments were very clear. When we move on to the 40 pounds of K2O, as I indicated, as the previous table, I indicated that there were some stain losses, but the visual difference was significant. So we move it to the highest potassium application rate. There's much more plants, and the stain was much healthier compared to the controls. But this was the beginning of the growing season, May 5, 2014. If we look at the same plots after a frosting event, that also explains why we observed those differences. So this picture was taken in January, the same year, but right after a freezing event. So these are, you can see the flags here. This is the entire experimental area. And we look at the control plots. After the freezing event, the plants were burned, but there was some green here, and those are actually weeds. When you look at the highest K application rate, the plants, Jiggs, survived much better to that freezing event that year. There's much more plants actively growing after a freezing event. So again, that relates to the ability of plants to resist to stress. In that case, it was very clear that the plots that were receiving higher potassium application rates were able to recover from a freezing event much quicker than the control plots. So now switching to the Limpograss. Same data, cumulative data from 4 harvests, 2012, 13, and 14, as affected by K potassium application rate. Interestingly, the first year of the study, we didn't observe any significant impact of K fertilization on Limpograss responses. So even though the soil tested very low in potassium, we didn't increase Limpograss production by applying potassium fertilization. However, in 2013 and 2014, we observed a linear increase in Limpograss production as the K fertilization increased. And again, if you compare this data with the previous data on the Jiggs Bermudagrasss, the difference here between the controls and the plots that received the highest potassium rate were significantly less. Or in other words, by applying 80 pounds of potassium in 2013, I increased my production by about 38%. In 2014, about 40%. So if you remember the data that I showed you earlier, at the 2014 growing season, the difference between the controls and the plots receiving potassium for Jiggs Bermudagrasss was about 370% increase. So the magnitude of these differences was considerably less for Limpograss. Now let's look at the frequency and ground cover. Similarly to Jiggs, there was quite significant loss in stand in the plots that were not fertilized with potassium, and when we added 80 pounds of potassium per year, the stand loss was reduced quite significantly. One thing I forgot to mention when I shared the data about Limpograss was the crude protein. Potassium usually does not increase crude protein concentration in the plant. So in fact, when you look at the crude protein concentration, it is reduced as the potassium fertilization increase. And that's basically a dilution effect. You produce more biomass, you have lower crude protein concentration, but on a per acre basis, crude protein is increased. So here's the picture of the Limpograss plots at the beginning of the 2014 growing season. Remember the Jiggs Bermudagrasss control plots, it was basically bare ground. Now for the Jiggs, you can see more health plants growing in that treatment. When you move to the 40 pounds, you see more grass, much better growth. And as you move to the highest rate, and you see a much healthier stand as well. So as a conclusion of this study, The potassium fertilization increased both Jiggs, Bermudagrasss, and Limpograss yields. However, and also decreased the stain losses during that 3-year study. However, despite the positive effect of K fertilization, the dry matter yields observed in 2014 were significantly less than compared to the beginning of the study. So that led us to conclude that the amount of potassium that we were applying, particularly to the Jiggs Bermudagrass plots, were not sufficient to maintain a health stand and sustain the same level of production. And if we compare the amount of potassium that was exported via above ground biomass, they were in generally either the same or less than what we were applying via fertilizer. However, they were still not sufficient to maintain the same level of production during the 3-year study. Another conclusion of the study was that Limpograss require much lower levels of potassium fertilization as compared to Jiggs Bermudagrass, and it has a much less impact on Limpograss stain losses as compared to Jiggs Bermudagrass. And also, another important observation of the study was that I didn't share any data with respect to these grasses' responses to phosphorus fertilization because there is no P fertilization impact. So regardless of if you remember at the beginning of the presentation, I mentioned the initial soil tested median in phosphorus, and despite that, all the harvests that occurred during the 3-year study, we were unable to create a condition that plants would respond to phosphorus fertilization. So moving on from experimental plots here at the research center to large-scale producer-oriented demonstration. This picture was taken by Eddie Jennings. He's a multi-county livestock agent in Central Florida. This picture was taken in May 17, 2013, and this is a Tifton 44 Bermudagrass hayfield. And what Ed Jennings was observing in his counties, the counties that he worked, is that those hayfields were never able to regrowth in the beginning of that spring, in the beginning of that growing season. So we had, like I said, in 2013, we had some late freezing events in February, March, and those hayfields were never able to recover from those freezing events. So we ran a number of testings, and we were not sure what the reason was. But one common thing among all these different hayfields that were being affected by this severe stain loss was that they were only fertilized with liquid nitrogen. So there was no previous history of potassium fertilization. So what Eddie decided to do was to establish some demonstration sites in different locations, different producers, hayfields, and we tested potassium application versus no potassium application. So if you look at this picture taken in May 17, look at the tanks here. I'll move on to the next slide. This is the same area, 42 days later. This is June 28, 2013, after the potassium application. So those hayfields were able to recover quite significantly after the potassium application. We also had very good weather conditions during that period, during that 42 days period. So there was a lot of rainfall that also contributed to that response. But it's important to, I think one of the messages that we were able to communicate with producers in this area was that it's very important to manage potassium, particularly if we were mechanically harvesting the above ground biomass, because in a year where the stands will be subject to a stress, it could be a weather stress, it could be a disease, they'll be much more successful at recovering from the stress if the potassium levels are adequate in the soil. So with that, I want to finish my presentation, and again, if you have any questions, please feel free to either call me or email me at any time. Thank you so much for your attention.